on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the government's pausing Syrian asylum claims after the country's president was forced from power. The group which took control of Damascus yesterday, HTS, is classed as a terror organisation by the UK. Under President Assad's regime, millions have been living in poverty, while many fled the country. The Foreign Secretary David Lammy has told MPs they're monitoring the situation as many refugees return to Syria.
This flow into Syria could quickly become a flow back out and potentially increase the numbers using dangerous illegal migration routes to continental Europe and the United Kingdom.
A 26-year-old's been arrested in America with a weapon consistent with a gun used to kill US healthcare boss Brian Thompson in New York last week. Luigi Mangione is in custody. Fake IDs and documents were also recovered. Health leaders are urging people eligible for the flu jab to come forward as cases skyrocket. Last week, an average of 1,100 people were in hospital each day compared to 250 for the same period last year. And disgraced referee David Coote has been sacked. It follows an investigation into a video which emerged of him making derogatory remarks about Liverpool and Jurgen Klopp. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 43 points at 83.52. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.20. LBC weather, a cold night for northern areas, some rain in the far southeast and a low of -7. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, welcome to the programme. It's Monday's Cross Question at 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. On the panel tonight, next to me, to my left, Baroness Olly Grender, Liberal Democrat peer. Next to her, Daniel Kawczynski, former Conservative MP for Shrewsbury and Atcham. To my right, so Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, Chief Fire Officer, who's also a researcher in risk and behavioural science at Cardiff University, which sounds very intimidating and intellectual. And next to her, Andy Silvester, London editor of The Times. Of course, he used to do the business bulletin every day on this programme, but has gone on to worse things. Sorry, Andy. You can phone us on 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, our first question from Scott in West Hampstead, who says, should the West have any role in helping Syria to become a stable, peaceful democracy? Or should we leave well alone, given our largely failed attempts to help bring peace and stability to Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya? Daniel Kawczynski.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that how pleasing it is that another one of those chinks that the Iranians have been pushing in the Middle East has fallen. Assad was propped up by the Iranians, and they used Syria as a sort of conduit to supply Hezbollah in Beirut. I consider Iran to be the single biggest threat to peace and stability and security in the Middle East. So the fact that Assad is gone is obviously something to be encouraged because it weakens Iran as well. Whether or not we should intervene in Syria in helping it to democracy, well, I think we need to start as the question as you've posed. We have failed spectacularly in Libya. I've just come from a meeting with some Libyans who are visiting London. We intervened in Libya. Cameron intervened in Libya on the back of a fag packet with no plans to help the country afterwards. He was garlanded with flowers when he arrived with Hollande immediately after the revolution finished. And then Libya fell into chaos. Sarkozy, forgive me. And so we do not have a good track record, actually, in intervening in these countries. And I think we ought to be leaving it more to the Arab League and regional powers rather than intervening ourselves.
Do we also not have to wait to see exactly who this group HTS is? Because they are a prescribed terror organisation in this country, so surely they have got to prove that they have changed, that they want to run it may not be a democracy, but it doesn't have to be a democracy to be a stable country. Should we wait for them to prove themselves?
I think undoubtedly. Somebody was saying to me, should we be encouraging Syrians living in the United Kingdom to return to Syria? Well, far too early to say that. The early signs are encouraging. They allowed the Prime Minister under Assad to stay. They didn't, behead him or do something sinister to government officials. So they are giving the impression that they have moved on from their terrorist activities and that they want to create a peaceful, democratic Syria. But it's far too early to actively be encouraging Syrians in this country unless they want to go voluntarily until we see the mist clearing.
Olly Grender.
Yes, I agree with Daniel. We need to take a huge pause. On the other hand, there is expertise, and we have it across our table from us, so I'd love to hear. We have expertise and support that can help. This is a country that remains devastated from an earthquake a year ago. This is a country where there is significant need for support and help. There will be people in that prison, Cyanada, that have been locked up for years and years, and therefore any expertise that the West can offer in terms of help on that. However, Daniel's absolutely right when it comes to Libya. Libya was done without any intelligence, and several independent reports since have said that it was a terrible error. But I still think that there is a place for Western countries to help and support. In a way, we need to see a nudge towards democracy, but it is very, very, very early days.
But wasn't Libya a disaster because the Libyan different factions said, just leave it to us? Once the initial airstrikes had happened and the situation had calmed down a bit, they just said, well, look, no, we don't want you to come in. We'll deal with it, thank you very much. And we then said, OK, up to you.
There was no infrastructure there at all to come in and create a new democracy, an inclusive democracy. By the way, I think democracy is a long-term thing in a scenario like this. I think sometimes in the West we tend to push and impose at quite a high speed because it's what we've been used to for so long. And I think it's about understanding that this is slow steps and cautious steps. But above all, people there need aid. Above all, people there need help. They need help to find these prisoners that are possibly hidden on different layers. I don't know what will come out of that particular story.
Sabrina Cohen-Hatton.
It's a really, really important question at the moment, and I think we all have a vested interest in some more stability across the globe, not just in the Middle East. And I think I'll firstly put my cards on the table and say I have a vested interest. I've got skin in the game. I'm British, Israeli and Moroccan, and I have family out there.
And there aren't many of those to the pound.
Or to the shekel. No, but I've got family out there, and I've lived 41 years experiencing instability within the region, and so it does make me anxious to see this. And I'm pleased that there's going to be change in the region, and Assad was a brutal dictator. So actually, this gives an opportunity for change, but it also brings with it, I think, a moment of potential great danger. And one thing I think is really important is to listen to Syrian voices within this. It can be so easy sometimes to export our own worldview into other places in the world, and we don't always listen enough. But there is an incredibly great need for humanitarian support in the region. Of course there is, and I think that comes first and foremost. But I think what I'm equally as concerned about is what it means for us here in the UK. It was only today that I saw the report come out from Dame Sarah Khan that talked about the erosion of the societal fabric that we've got in terms of democracy here in the UK at the moment. And I'm worried about what it means for us, what it means for homegrown extremism, what it means for greater disinformation campaigns that we've already seen polarising our society. So that, for me, I think, is the most important thing for us to consider at the moment.
Andy.
I mean, look, one thing that isn't happening tonight in Moscow and Tehran is people sat around a radio set like this talking about how they should leave Syrian voices to organise the future of Damascus. It's been a huge defeat, diplomatic defeat in both of those places. And those countries, those regimes will be looking at this and working out how to advance their interests going forward. And in the West, it would be naive and I think misjudged to pretend that isn't happening. Now, no one is talking about, as are your question, Libya is one example. The other questions there, we had boots on the ground in those countries and we pulled out too quickly and we didn't have an exit plan and there are all sorts of things. We're not talking about that. What we are talking about is you've got a group like HTS, which, if they survive beyond another week or 2 weeks out of the alphabet soup of people that are looking to be in charge of that country, we are going to have to bring them in probably sooner than you'd like. There is probably going to not be the level of wait and see that you might want, because you need to invite them, get around the table, because they will be invited to the tables of countries that are effectively our enemies. We are in a low-level state of war with Russia. We are in a low-level state of war with Iran. So I think it would be naive to say hands off entirely. I think a British government should represent British interests.
What about the Israelis tonight? Because I think a lot of people in Israel will be thinking, well, this wouldn't have happened had the events of the last year not happened. And is Israel strengthened by what's happened in Syria?
I think that Israel would be very nervous at the moment, actually. Syria provided a land bridge from Iran to arm Hezbollah, who were attacking Israel via Lebanon. And I think that the removal of Assad provides the potential for additional proxy groups. So I think Israel will be nervous, and you can tell by some of the actions that we've seen, the moving into the Golan Heights, for example, the airstrikes on some of the Syrian military infrastructure over recent days. So I think that there will be more nervousness than jubilation.
Anybody else?
I think that's entirely fair, isn't it? I think you, if you're in that part of the world, if you go to the Golan Heights, you can stand on mountains that have coffee shops called Coffee and look out over Lebanon, Syria, and Israel at the same time. It's very, very
I've
close.
done that. It's weird, isn't it?
It is. Actually. It is a strange experience, and I think, as Daniel said, anything that weakens Iran is a good thing in this region. But if you're an Israeli government right now, we know what happens. We know what can happen when people decide, actually, we'd quite like to storm over that border. We saw it in fairly sharp relief in 2003.
I would add that with incoming President Trump, there is an opportunity for the Abraham Accords to be resurrected. I know that Morocco has signed the Abraham Accords, and I pay tribute to the Moroccan ambassador when I've met him on many occasions, the courage, the vision of the Moroccan people, and being one of only 4, I think, Arab nations that have signed the Abraham Accords. Iran saw the danger to it of these Arab countries starting to engage with the Abraham Accords, and that's why they have tried to cause as much destabilization in the region as possible in order to disincentivize other Arab countries from following. And I think that if there is peace and security in Syria and there is some form of change in Lebanon, other Arab nations can finally get round the table with Israel and start and follow the Bahrainis, follow the Moroccans and others, and finally creating peace with Israel, which is what most normal, sensible people would want.
Let's take a follow-up question from Ash in Notting Hill. Ash, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, basically, thanks for taking my call. What it is, this question is remaining as a question, important question, which once we didn't have a guts to do it in Parliament. If I say that because we were thinking about what's going to happen in future. So IRGC is the, Revolutionary Guard in Iran, which has got lots of properties and stuff in Syria, which is it was in the interest to leave the Syria, and now they might come back and bite. The reason for that, the £30 billion of investment in there, as well as another £40 billion Syria owes them.
Okay, Ash, we need to get to your question.
Yeah, So this is. I just want to. I can't emphasize any more than that how it's important for them. So are we going to this time around? Are we going to recognise IRGC as a terrorist group or not?
It is a good question, and I've always scratched my head as to wonder why we haven't. But there does seem to be a reluctance to do this. Do any of you have an explanation for this? That'd be a no then.
No.
The question was why are the Iranian Revolutionary Guards not a prescribed?
Why haven't they become a prescribed terror organisation? Because they clearly are.
I would presume that there is, as I understand it, in making a prescribed terrorist group, which we're coming back to with HTS, right?
Yeah.
It means that you effectively can't engage with them at all.
Yeah.
Now, should diplomatic relations with Iran improve, it would be odd if you had a prescribed, effectively the military wing, and you couldn't then talk. I would assume that's the level of detail. It's just about freeing up the Foreign Office, basically, to have back channels, as a wild guess.
Daniel?
I don't think that it's possible to have any form of normal dialogue or peace with the Iranians. I mean, they have demonstrated over the last, ever since the Iran-Iraq war finished, they have demonstrated an absolute pathological determination to destabilize and control the region. And I think we've got to be, I'm afraid, like in the days of the Cold War, we've got to outspend the Iranians and put a lot of pressure on them to get them to back off. They're not going to deal with diplomatic niceties, I'm afraid.
But with Trump coming in and the message he put on X already today, we know that we're moving in the opposite direction with the US, that in fact any kind of intervention, even good and useful interventions, are possibly going to be a thing of the past in a month's time. Which comes back to the point about needing to move at a slightly faster pace if anyone is interested in intervention. Now, I'm not saying definitely that should happen. However, I think Trump is as much of a threat to a level of peace in this area, partly because he is, kind of saying, no, we just up drawbridges, and we don't intervene at all. Same, obviously, in Ukraine. And therefore, I think time is limited before he takes over the presidency if there is a potential for levels of humanitarian help and support, for levels of diplomatic nudge towards democracy.
Well, I think the question that we have to ask is, when has British intervention actually helped? I suppose.
Well, ask the people of Kosovo. Ask the people of Sierra Leone.
I was actually about to mention those two. Sierra Leone and Kosovo, both under Blair, are classic examples where we intervened, and we intervened successfully, and the long-term ramifications of that intervention has been beneficial for the local people. But there are, just for those two, I mean, you and I can both name Sierra Leone and Kosovo in the last 30 years, but just for those two, there are even more where we've intervened where it's been a total disaster.
But just because it's been a total disaster possibly doesn't negate the original reason for intervening. I mean, bad decisions may have been made after the initial decision. I mean, just as they were in Iraq and to a great degree in Afghanistan, it has to be said. But that doesn't mean to say that just because those went wrong, that we should now shut up shop and say we should never intervene again, surely.
Oh, no, but we have to learn the lessons from the mistakes. Yeah. And I think there were only 16 Conservative MPs, and I, to my dying day, regret not being one of them. But there were only 16 Conservative MPs who refused to back Cameron's intervention over Libya. And what we had in the run-up to that intervention was wall-to-wall coverage of the civil war on Sky News and the British media. And Cameron intervened knowing that the Gaddafi regime was weak and ultimately without a long-term game plan of supporting that country. And that's what I object to. Very easy to go in and kick the...
How did you vote in the 2013 Syria vote?
I voted to intervene. I voted to intervene on that. I listened to the argument and I voted to intervene. And I think if we had, well, who knows what would have happened. But I go back to the Libya thing. Libya is a country I've known for many, many years. And of course, we are hugely interdependent with these countries because they are our neighbours. This isn't a country far away of which we know little. A lot of the illegal migration entering Europe comes through Libya, and it's this lack. I will never forgive Lord Cameron for the lack of planning and then just dumping Libya after the intervention.
OK, right, we're going to move on in just a moment to other subjects. Your call's welcome, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:20.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
8:22. Let me reintroduce our panel. Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton is a Chief Fire Officer, also a researcher in risk and behavioural science at Cardiff University. That sounds incredibly intimidating. What does it actually mean? Is it sort of like neuroscience?
It is. It's behavioural neuroscience. I'm particularly interested in what happens in our brain when we make decisions under pressure and what kind of things might bias our decision-making, particularly under pressure. Although I've just recently expanded into looking at dogs as well.
Oh, well, that's much more interesting.
Ian's
The
favourite subject.
psychology of dogs,
dogs.
I just think is fascinating.
Oh, they're incredible.
Yes.
Absolutely incredible.
Well, we could do a whole hour on that, but
we
we're better
really
not. Andy Silvester, London editor of The Times, is next to Sabrina. Next to me, Olly Grender, Liberal Democrat peer, and Daniel Kawczynski, former Conservative MP. Tammy is asking, is Rachel Reeves right to want to reset our relationship with Europe? Now, the Chancellor has attended the Eurogroup meeting of EU finance ministers in Brussels today, the first time since Brexit that a British Chancellor has been to this meeting. Reeves has told reporters she wants to reset the UK's relationship with Europe, but says the government's red lines of not rejoining the single market or customs union and not restoring freedom of movement are still in place. Olly Grender.
Yes. Of course, we should reset our relationship
What does
with
that
Europe.
mean, though?
Well, I don't know what it means for Rachel Reeves entirely, and I have read as much as I can before coming on about what she was saying. I think, above all, this might be from the government about mood music, and I don't see that as a really bad thing. I mean, obviously, I would want slightly more specifics. You'd be astonished to hear, Ian, but really, you know, kind of, we now know from the OBR that our cut in trade is about 15% as a result of Brexit. We now know that if you want to sell something, you know, as a farmer, if you want to sell fish to France, you had to do one consignment note. Now you have to do 23 individual different procedures. If you're a farmer in Kent and you want to sell sausages to Calais, it's now, you know, kind of, you can't do it. It's just not possible. So we know that trade has been dramatically constrained by this. But also we know that there are all sorts of potential ways of, in small steps, resetting the relationship, and I think it is a good thing to try. So, for instance, we talk about a UK mobility scheme and making sure that young people can travel with more freedom than currently exists. And we think that that is a good thing. Also,
but Labour have rejected it.
Labour have rejected it, yeah, but we think it's the right thing to do. And so a reset is a good thing to do. I suspect that the substance of the reset, I suspect that Keir Starmer has been sounding this out, given all his foreign travel recently. And I think what he has been doing is testing the waters. And I think what he has been finding is that when it comes down to specifics, given the terrible deal that we had, it's a much harder gig.
Andy Silvester, isn't it true that Rishi Sunak reset the relationship with the EU after the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss years?
And the Windsor Framework, which was actually a pretty significant diplomatic achievement as it goes. He did. I think there is this sort of red light that goes off in the United Kingdom whenever we talk about Europe and resetting the relationship, where we go back to fighting the war of May 2016. And we do need to move beyond that for the good of the economy. There isn't a problem with Rachel Reeves going to Europe and saying it all got a bit much there. Just after we broke up, we were arguing over the DVDs. Do you want to go for a drink? There's no problem there. The issue will be down the line if some of this flag flying, some of this sort of gently floating a closer relationship, if Labour are forced to make a decision about, do we propose this to the British public? Do we actually put something down on paper and then we have a manifesto, then we're going to fight this war all over again? Is it a problem for the Chancellor of the United Kingdom to go and visit and be nice to our biggest trading partner? It is not a problem.
Sabrina?
I mean, it's a really interesting one, and I'll leave whether or not I'll leave the policy implications for the politicians, but I think good relationships are going to be good for Britain generally. And I think what's the problem that we're trying to solve? When we look at the UK at the moment and we look at our economy, we look at the crisis that we have over the cost of living, we're seeing unprecedented levels of poverty. Just today, there was a report by the Salvation Army that found there are 50,000 people who are working but still experiencing homelessness in the UK at the moment. And actually, we have got some significant problems here that we're looking at. So what's the fix that we're trying to solve? And I think that, for me, when you look at this in its entirety, it's going to be really important to focus on what we need as a country to be able to progress. We're not massively self-sufficient as a country. We import a lot of energy. We import a lot of food. So what are the best relationships for us to fix those issues? Or should we be more focused on becoming more self-sufficient as a country?
Daniel, I suspect you might disagree with Olly. I just a feeling I have.
Well, let's look at the facts. In 1980, the European Economic Community, now the EU, in 1980, the European Economic Community represented 25% of the world's economy. Today, that's down to 15% and falling, and will continue to fall. The only continent that will grow at a slower pace than the European Union over the next 3 decades is Antarctica. When we were in office, we moved from 7th largest exporter, this is after Brexit, we moved from 7th largest exporter to 4th largest exporter. Now, how does a tiny island with 60 million people become the world's 4th largest exporter? That's something which I think has to be taken into consideration.
But you would accept that since Brexit, trade with the EU has reduced? I mean, how can that be a good thing?
Well, the good thing is that we are spreading our wings much, much further than this rapidly shrinking market. And of course, one of the main benefits of leaving the European Union is that we are the only European country to have joined the world's largest trading bloc, the CPTPP in the Far East. Now, who is in the CPTPP? Some of the fastest growing economies in the world, with hundreds of millions of new middle-class consumers coming down the line every single year. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore. I mean, these are vastly emerging economies. And what are the long-term consequences of the United Kingdom being the sole European country to have entered into the CPTPP? Anything in terms of recalibrating our relationship with the European Union, which impinges or damages those new, extraordinary, unique attributes that we have as a trading partner will be not only counterintuitive, but a huge act of self-harm. And let me just end by saying this. The United States of America is actually our single largest trading partner as a single entity. Sir Keir wants to...
Well, the EU is a single entity, and that we have more than double the trade with America with
yes,
the EU.
And it's next door.
Yes, but we've had the interesting thing, of course, is though we've had a trade deficit with the European Union every single year for the last 40 years. We have a small trade surplus with the United States of America. That is also needs to be taken into consideration. Now we have, for the first time, the opportunity in the next 4 years to outmaneuver the French and the Germans and our other European competitors in helping British exporters to enter the American market. And if Sir Keir, because of his ideological refusal to accept that result from 2016, wants now to trash that opportunity, he's going to have to explain to a lot of British companies why he's not taking advantage.
Olly Grender, I can tell you're convinced.
Not very much.
Well, it is a convincing argument, surely, that world trade is going to expand outside Europe. That is a convincing argument.
World trade, of course, is fantastic, and we should be at the forefront of it. For instance, we were heading that way in 2015 in terms of, say, renewables. We were absolutely leading on kind of global systems and innovations in that area, but we fell back in that in recent years. But
how have we fallen back, given that we've reduced carbon emissions more than any other European country bar Sweden, given that we have the second, third and fourth biggest wind farms, offshore wind farms in the EU? How have we fallen back?
Well, definitely Japan, for instance, has overtaken us, and we were competitive at the time, for instance, in terms of selling those kind of products globally. We've also, you speak to any farmer and they will say that we have created uneven terms. We've created uneven terms in, for the, selling lamb from New Zealand. We've given competitive advantage there to others globally. So there are pluses and minuses on that. But most of all, I just think it is common sense for us to work and trade with our nearest neighbours, not see them as a kind of... It's almost like you describe them as an enemy that we need to beat into the ground or something.
I didn't say that. I said they're competitors.
Surely what we need to do is trade with these countries. And, small businesses... If you talk to them and ask them, they say the level of bureaucracy and red tape they have been tied in has been too much. And I take Andy's point very much about don't fight the boring old battle. I completely agree, and I am attempting to resist that. But what we do need to do is help and assist our small businesses to trade competitively elsewhere. And at the moment, they say that they are struggling on that.
Very quick.
One thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is the Commonwealth. 56 countries around the world representing a third of the world's population, and they have some of the fastest growing economies in the world. We are in a unique position, with our sovereign being the head of the Commonwealth, of taking advantage of our new independence as a sovereign nation to start changing our trading relations with Commonwealth countries. So rather than just giving them scraps off our table, we can actually start to reduce barriers to trade with Commonwealth nations.
It's always been a sort of bewilderment to me why we haven't got a Commonwealth free trade bloc. It's bizarre. But anyway, we need to move on to other subjects. It's 8:34, news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
The government's pausing Syrian asylum claims after the country's president was forced from power. The group which took control of Damascus yesterday, HTS, is classed as a terror organisation by the UK. Cammy Day has resigned as the leader of Edinburgh City Council following reports he sent inappropriate messages to Ukrainian refugees. He was suspended by the Labour Party yesterday and is also under police investigation but has not commented on reports. And disgraced referee David Coote has been sacked after a video emerged where he made derogatory comments about Liverpool and Jurgen Klopp. Bosses have confirmed his employment has been terminated after an investigation concluded he was in serious breach of his contract. LBC weather, a cold night for northern areas, thick cloud further south with some rain in the far southeast, a low of -7.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36. Daniel Kawczynski is with us, former Conservative MP. How are you coping with your post-parliamentary life, Daniel?
I've never been happier. Being 6'9", you're very recognisable. And for the first time in 2 decades, I can go to the local swimming pool. I've now moved to London. I can go to the local swimming pool, my local cinema, the park, without being molested. It's very
That's
good.
Nice.
It's very good for one's mental health.
OK. Right. We have also Baroness Olly Grender from the Liberal Democrats, Andy Silvester from The Times, and Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, who is a Chief Fire Officer. I mean, how's the fire service coping with you being here tonight?
I'm off duty.
Marvellous. Right, let's go to another text from Kathleen in Oxford. Talking of trade, should we really be cozying up to Saudi Arabia, given the many awful things that regime has done? Now, Keir Starmer has been in Riyadh today, meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The Prime Minister says economic growth cannot be achieved without securing investment from nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is, it has to be said, something slightly different from what he said in opposition. Sabrina.
Well, when you look at all of the nations out there, you could take the same position with many other nations. You could take Qatar, for example. You could take South Africa. You could take any one of a number of nations and determine whether or not we should, based on what they've done previously. I mean, I do have some sympathy towards the argument because it's important that we maintain values, but at what point do you want to progress a relationship, to influence, to move past that?
Andy?
I mean, I'm a journalist, so you can probably guess my views on the Saudi Arabian regime, since they sliced up one of our own very publicly and have done it to an awful lot of other people over history. But I'm not naive. I'm not an ideologue. It is clearly realpolitik that the British government is going to have relationships with Saudi Arabia. I think there are probably bigger questions about companies, very prominent companies who have tied up more closely with Saudi. And then there's a question about, well, did you need to do that? Was that absolutely the right thing to do when a week later you're touting around your ESG credentials to the city and talking about how you're all about giving Gen Z the chance in the workplace and social mobility and whatever else it might be that week? As you can tell, I was slightly jaded after my time at City AM of getting ESG statements. I think there's a bigger question for the private sector than there is the public sector or governments. They are a player. They are a regional player in a part of the world where, to use a sort of slightly trite phrase, it is all kicking off. And it would be naive not to have a relationship.
Daniel, I had a press release today from Human Rights Watch, which was all about the fact that countries, not just Saudi Arabia, but many other countries in that region, are exploiting labour which they spell Labor, and I thought, never send me a press release when you can't spell it in the King's English. But I mean, there is a point to this, isn't there? That if we just give countries like Saudi Arabia carte blanche to do what they like without any strings attached with our trade, then they're never going to improve in terms of human rights.
Well, I think you have to look at the direction of travel of a country like Saudi Arabia. When I went to Riyadh for the first time in 2005, there were no women in their parliament, in their Shura Council. Now 38% of members of their Shura Council are female. When I first went in 2005, women weren't allowed to drive. They weren't allowed to go overseas without a chaperone. They were all sorts. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to take part in the Olympic Games. And all of that has changed. And actually, the late King Abdullah said to me, "You're not going to do to us what you did to the Shah of Iran. You pushed him to westernize too quickly. It then gave the light to the mullahs to intervene. And then we had something 1,000 times worse than the Shah of Iran with the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Saudis are moving at their own pace. And what the late King Abdullah said to me is, we will move at the pace which allows us to take the most conservative elements of our society with us, and these reforms will bed down and take root. And the Saudis are, the direction of travel is right. And the people who are the most anti-Saudi are the ones who have never been there and never engaged with the people. This is a country that is moving in the right direction.
I think that, as ever, we need to use our place in the world to make sure that we raise human rights issues, and whether that's, ensuring that we raise, the significant human rights issues in some parts of China at the moment. We have to, whenever we are in a room, we have to make sure that we are raising it.
But there are ways of raising it, aren't there? I mean, I often think that when British prime ministers go to China or Saudi Arabia or any other ones of these countries, they effectively say at the beginning of the meeting, now obviously you know that I have to raise this issue of this prisoner X, Y and Z. Well, I've done that now, so should we move on? I'm sure it isn't as callous as that, but sometimes you get the impression that it is.
Yeah, but still, I think it's our role, and that we need to do that when we're in the room. So I think it's important. I think historically, we know that, halting trade on sugar was part of, a move on the slave trade. So, global trading, even back then. I know that Robin Cook said that he would attempt this when he became Foreign Secretary in 1997. I think it was much harder as a policy to pursue than he originally thought, when he said,
it lasted 3 days.
We'll only ethically, I think it is a very hard thing to do. But nonetheless, I think we should try.
Okay.
Can I just also add that hundreds of thousands of British jobs, particularly in BAE systems, rely upon our exports to Saudi.
Blood money, though, Daniel. That's what it is. That's what people say.
And if we were not exporting that void would be filled by the French, the Germans, the Chinese, and others.
Okay. Right. Question from Barry in Scunthorpe. Would Suella Braverman help or hinder reform? After her husband, Rael Braverman, defected to reform from the Conservatives, there are now rumours that the former Home Secretary could make the same move very soon. Though in a statement, she says her husband and her have a healthy respect for each other's independence. Olly?
I don't really know if she would help or hinder, but the growth of reform splits the right. So it's
the growth of the Liberal Democrats splits the left.
Sorry?
The growth of the Liberal Democrats splits the left.
We had a fabulous general election where we won 72 MPs. I would say that, some of those majorities were as a result of a healthy reform vote. I thought that was quite an interesting aspect of the general election. I'm sure you did as well, Iain.
That was what the Labour majority was built on, the reform vote, wasn't it, if you think about it? If you look at all of those seats that had a reform vote of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, there were literally hundreds of them that the Conservatives lost purely because of that.
Yeah. So I think it's a significant vote against something rather than a vote for something, as votes in first past the post often are. I don't know whether she'll help or hinder.
Okay.
But I'm kind of not very bothered about it.
You don't really give a damn, do you? Sabrina.
Well, I've got a day job that means I've got to be politically impartial, so I'm going to be really boring and dodge the bit about the particular politicians, but instead there is a deeper point to this, and that's about division, I think. And it was just today, the report that I mentioned earlier on by Dame Sarah Khan was talking about the inflammatory language that we hear and the impact that it has on society. And that doesn't matter whether it's from an elected member, it doesn't matter whether it's from a social media influencer or from normalised language in the media. Actually, what we're talking about here is deep polarizations within society that have happened over the past few years. And actually, I think it's really important that we talk about some of the things that people are worried about that are causing those divisions, and we have those conversations really openly without defensiveness, so that we can perhaps try and find some common ground. Because one thing that I don't see anything of at the moment is common ground.
Andy.
Well, Ian, I'm here to talk about policies, not personalities. Would be the
boring.
easy get out. I think I don't.
Is that the inner Tony Benn in you coming in?
Yeah, absolutely is. It's. I don't see why Suella Braverman joining Reform would be a bad thing for Reform. I mean, third/fourth parties, whatever you want to call them, have struggled to break through in British politics for years. Suella Braverman turns up. Well, it's one more media appearance. It's
Braverman.
one more. Sorry.
Although she did admit to Rachel Johnson on her podcast the other day that she does use both herself.
Well,
having told us it was Braverman, she's slightly gone back on that.
Call me Steve if you want. I mean, do whatever. She guarantees them. She guarantees them a bit more airtime. She guarantees them another person to go up against a Conservative MP, which is really what they're, media-wise, is what they're interested in. I don't think it would hurt. I don't necessarily think Reform's success at the next general election, they will be decided on whether the former Home Secretary, who I'm now going to refuse to name so I don't get it wrong, joins them.
Now, text here from Michael, who says, finally a person talking sense on LBC. The lady is completely correct. So that narrows it down to two of you.
Well, that would be you then.
I'm not sure which.
My money's on you.
And but somebody likes you too, Andy. Somebody says LBC should have snapped up Andy Silvester as a presenter when he left City AM. What an interesting and engaging guy. Perhaps he'd like to take over from that ghastly Iain Dale when he's put out to pasture. Thank you, Liam in Fishguard.
Charming.
Always appreciate your support.
I told my mum not to put the last bit in.
Mum called Liam. Interesting. 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. Now, rather disgracefully, I didn't give Daniel a chance to answer the last question about Suella Braverman. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, all I would say is that it's interesting that her husband is now campaigning for reform and she's a Conservative MP. What I would say is that at the next general election in 2029, there's no guarantee that we will win. But if we can beat Labour, if we are the largest party, then we need to have a coalition with a reform. I think Lord Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, referred to UKIP as fruitcakes. The next day in Shrewsbury, the UKIP party was selling fruitcakes in the local market, and they were selling like hotcakes. It's not a good thing to insult your opponents. And the right actually does need, if we're going to get rid of Sir Keir from number 10, we've got to have much more cooperation and collaboration with reform.
But you love insulting the Liberal Democrats, so why wouldn't you insult reform? They are political opponents.
The Lib Dems are ideologically...
Like the French.
Lib Dems are ideologically totally opposite of the Conservatives, and they are great opponents to have. But the Reform Party is full of people who are right of centre, who think like us and believe in us, but were fed up with the way that the Conservative Party treated them.
Why would Reform do a deal with the Conservatives at the moment? Reform and Labour constituencies were far more powerful as a force. They're speaking towards different values that maybe appeal to Labour voters as much as they do Conservative voters.
Well, if the Reform Party, let's say, get 30 or 40 seats at the next election, if they don't win the next election and they are a minority party with 30 or 40 seats, and the Conservatives are missing 40 seats to form a majority,
Liberal Democrats become the opposition.
I don't think we would ever get into bed with the Lib Dems again, and neither would they get into a coalition with us. So the only way, and don't forget, what we will have by 2029 is we will have had 4 years or 5 years of Sir Keir Starmer, and I think the opportunity or the thinking about right of centre parties will be that more galvanised and determined to eject him from number 10 than it was at this election.
We haven't got a excuse me, we haven't got a Labour MP on the panel tonight, but it's all gone terribly well after 5 months, let alone 5 years, hasn't it? Let's go to a text question from Brian in Preston. Why are we still so badly prepared to deal with flooding? Now, I know you're a fire officer, Sabrina, but presumably you have to deal with flooding as well.
We do. And actually an ongoing debate that we've had is whether or not we should have a statutory duty to respond to flooding. Because believe it or not, the Fire and Rescue Service in England do not have a statutory requirement to respond to flooding. Now, of course we do, but it also means that we have to make a provision for flooding from within our own budgets. We don't get anything additional for that either. So, I mean, it's a very, very fair point. And especially when we see climate change having an impact, we're seeing more and more flooding happening. It's becoming more and more severe. Budgets are shrinking in fire and rescue services and policing. So actually, it's a very, very fair point. You have people who are highly trained, highly skilled and ready to respond, but we need to be resourced to do it. We can't do it on goodwill alone.
But why are we so badly prepared to deal with it? I mean, it's obviously not down to the fire service. I mean, I think £2.5 billion extra was put into flood defences by the last government. But the problem is you could spend $50 billion and still only scratch the surface, if that's not an inappropriate way of putting it.
Yeah, it's a fair point. But actually, I think when you look at some of the infrastructure that we have around flooding defences, I think we need more. You know, it is a growing problem. You look at the water infrastructure that we have. You look at the impact that climate change is having. You look at the urban flooding that's happening more and more and more. We do need to do more. But actually, I think that there's an argument for making communities more resilient as well. I mean, we've had some incidents where we've had some great effectiveness by putting pumps in place and helping the local community to be able to use them so that we can get to more communities at one place when you've got such widespread flooding. So, I mean, flood defences are important, and I would absolutely agree with that point. But there is a point for me about how do we make people more resilient to flooding as well.
Daniel.
Well, Shrewsbury, my former constituency, right in the middle of a river loop. Of course, in those days, we built towns in the middle of a river loop for defence purposes. very counterintuitive now, and we ended up flooding every single year. This was our single biggest problem, and the misery and chaos that it caused and the damage to business was absolutely palpable. And the proudest thing that I did as a Member of Parliament is, from a perspective of interdependence, we created a caucus of all 48 Members of Parliament who have the River Severn flowing through their constituencies, Britain's longest river. And rather than just putting flood defences, which protect small areas of your own constituency and then push the problem further downstream to let other people deal with that problem, we wanted to look at it holistically. And now that we're out of the European Union, another benefit is that for the first time we don't need to comply with the Common Agricultural Policy, and we can pay farmers upstream to hold on to water. And this is what we were bidding for £500 million for this project when the general election was called. But I'm very pleased that my Labour successor is taking on this mantle, because we need to think about the whole of the river and how we incentivise landowners and farmers across the border in Wales to benefit financially whilst protecting all of these communities further downstream.
Olly and Andy, if you can answer briefly, we've got a really good next question, which I want to try and fit in if we can.
So my understanding is that budgets in this area have reduced.
They've gone up. Massively.
No, but over the past few years, they have definitely reduced the budgets in this area.
Not my information, but
right.
Not going to fall out with you about it.
So that's what I understand from kind of local authority members that I speak to. And so, there has been a reduction in defence, in the defences of, kind of against flooding. And that's what we need to build up. But obviously this is also around the climate emergency. And that's just a critical issue that we probably don't have time to go into, but is, a definite component part of this issue.
Andy?
Three very quick things. One, it's going to get worse. Two, it seems very strange to me that something that has rescue service in the name doesn't have funding for flooding rescue. And third, my former colleagues in the City of London, who are doing extraordinary work to keep, frankly, house insurance down for these people through flood ray and various other bits and pieces of very clever engineering, is the sort of thing the City of London doesn't get enough credit for.
Interesting. I was reading, was it this morning or yesterday, about Tenbury Wells in Gloucestershire, I think it is, where the whole high street is going to basically cease to function because every year it's flooded and they can't get insurance. And the costs of running their businesses are now such that Tenbury Wells is not going to have a high street. And this sort of thing, I think, is going to increase massively. Right, very quick answers on this one, please. From Jen in New Cross. Keira Knightley says the famous Love Actually scene with the cue cards was creepy and slightly stalkerish, especially given she was 17 at the time it was filmed. Should Love Actually really be a Christmas staple family film, or does it set an alarming trend that kind of behaviour is okay? God save us from questions like this. Sabrina?
I actually really like Love Actually. So I'm good with Love Actually, but if my husband's best friend was really mean to me all the time and then knocked on my door and held up a sign basically declaring their undying love and then asking me not to tell my husband, I would feel slightly uncomfortable with that, and I think maybe he should have a word with himself. But I wouldn't ban Love Actually for
No, quite.
It is just a film, but there is a broader context of an interview recently with Keira Knightley, which I think this has been pulled out of, and it is about the experience of being a young woman in this industry. And I think that kind of wider, point that she is making, I think we should listen to. This specific, I don't
But
think
where
so
are we
much,
going to end up here? Because today a complaint has been made to Labour Party headquarters about West Streeting making a joke about Louise Haigh at the Spectator Annual Awards in quite a funny speech. He also made jokes about Ed Miliband, Rachel Reeves and goodness knows who else. They said it was bullying Louise Haigh. I mean, are we going to get to a point where nobody is going to be allowed to do anything that might be vaguely near a line which somebody arbitrarily draws, or that we aren't going to be able to tell any jokes at all in case we're accused of bullying? Daniel?
Well, to go back to the original question, Love Actually, I thought, I think he acted in an impulsive way. He was clearly very much in love. It's not something I would have done myself, but I think it's perfectly reasonable, and we should just get over it.
And I mean, I suppose it's
on your complaint point, Ian, that is why I think it is good that people can complain, because sometimes there are very significant complaints, and we know that these are coming out.
Well, it's something serious. Complain about it,
but then
not...
having an independent complaints procedure is a good thing, because it can overrule something like this whilst listening to other things.
Okay, Andy.
I think all of this stuff is slightly absurd. It trivialises real issues. If you want to see bullying of young women, then go onto the internet. Don't talk about Love Actually 23 years ago.
Yes.
Right, our fun question, which unusually I haven't given the panel prior notice of because I forgot. Alfie in Devon says, Donald Trump has said that Prince William looks better in person after they met in Paris over the weekend, after going to the reopening of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Who or what else pleasantly surprised you? Now, this could be a famous person who is nicer than you expected them to be, or even a place which you expected to be a bit run down or rough, but was actually very pleasant. Who would like to start?
I really wanted you to say Tunbridge Wells.
Thank you, Andy.
Iain Dale. He pleasantly surprised me in person.
I know, because apparently I'm very scary. Sabrina, have you found me scary?
Terrifying. Can you not tell? I'm quaking here.
Go on, what's your answer?
Oh, that is a really good question. What did I find? Halloumi. Halloumi, actually. I'd always refused to eat it because I wasn't a massive cheese fan, and despite the squeaking, I quite enjoyed it.
And you
so
call
I'm
yourself part Moroccan?
I know, right?
Ollie?
Long time ago, I was the tiny junior press officer organising a photo in Parliament for a very significant person who'd come out of prison, and there were 30, people who were way more important than me. And he made a beeline for me and said hello and asked me about myself. Nelson Mandela.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's a name drop.
But you thought you might be a bit nasty?
No, I just didn't know, kind of what he would be like. He was literally just out of prison. He'd literally come to the UK. I was the most junior, least important, least interesting person in the room. And he made a beeline and said hello. And he was lovely.
Well, in mid-January, I'm going to go and see the prison cell that he spent so long in.
Oh, wow.
Daniel?
The late Tony Benn. When I was first elected as a Member of Parliament in 2005, I was pathologically opposed to everything that man stood for and everything he said. And he invited me to the tea room for a chat, and it was one of the most incisive and interesting conversations I've ever had. He said there were two types of politicians, weathercocks and signposts, and he is very much a signpost. And I think that, he demonstrated the ability to push an agenda and a sort of ideology without being overtly rude and aggressive. And that's a lesson for modern-day politicians.
I interviewed Tony Benn a few months before he died, and he's the only person that I've ever interviewed who fell asleep during the middle of the interview, which I hope doesn't happen in the next hour on LBC. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in today. Tomorrow's panel, we have Rachel Cunliffe from the New Statesman, the Conservative MP, Sir Roger Gale, Green Party peer and former leader Baroness Natalie Bennett, and LBC's own Henry Riley. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to continue our conversation about the events in Syria. And I really want to ask you a fairly general question, actually. What next for Syria? And it's really an invitation to people from Syria who live in this country or who just happen to be listening now to answer it, really. Tell me what you want. And what would enable you to make the decision to return to Syria and help in the rebuilding of the country? We're going to be joined by Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP, who met Bashar al-Assad on several occasions during visits to Syria. Afra Hashem joins us as well, Syrian human rights campaigner who's part of the international organisation, the Syria Campaign. So we're looking forward to your calls. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the UK has paused decisions on asylum applications from Syrians following the collapse of the Assad regime. The Home Office says it's assessing the current situation and will respond to emerging issues. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says the UK is not considering whether to delist banned terror group HTS. Sir Keir Starmer has been speaking in Saudi after it brought down the Syrian government.
No decision is pending at all on this. It is far too early at the moment. The focus has to be on talking to our allies, making sure that this is an opportunity for Syria, and therefore we have to work to make sure that it's a peaceful opportunity.
A man detained with a gun similar to the one used to kill a senior health executive in New York is being questioned. CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, was shot dead last Wednesday. The leader of Edinburgh City Council has resigned following reports he sent inappropriate messages to Ukrainian refugees. Cammy Day says a recent commentary on his personal life is detracting from his work. Former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt has told LBC the practice of burying stillborn babies in mass graves could have continued while he was in office in the early 2010s. An LBC investigation has today revealed how there are more than 89,000 stillborns buried like this around the country. We've also found records are patchy, inconsistent, and most are not available online. Mr Hunt was asked by Andrew Marr on LBC when he became aware